And so this phenomenon actually sets apart like native speakers and robots. So if you listen to kind of like AI speech of Chinese, even though all of the tones are correct, everything is fine, they don't sound very natural. And why is that? Because AI, at least as of now, does not have Hi, welcome back to another episode of Juicy Two Shoes, and today we're going to talk about a topic that has been highly requested by you guys. So what is it? Let's get into it right now. In most languages, you can turn a sentence into a question simply by raising the end of that sentence. For example, you like broccoli is a statement. It goes down. But if you simply raise the end of the sentence and say, you like broccoli? Going up, it turns into a question. But how does this work in atonal language where changing the pitch could change one word into an entirely different word? For example, in Mandarin Chinese, this is a sentence for this is water. 这是水. So as you can see, every character has its own pitch. We have two falling pitches and then one basically falling and then rising at the end. And this pitch is integral to the meaning of the word. Let's say I try to change the end of the sentence to a slightly up. We would get 这是水. The 水, which meant water, now is 水, which means who. So instead of saying this is water, we're actually saying now, who is this? So as you can see, you cannot change the pitches of words in Chinese willy-nilly to turn it into a question. So when I taught Mandarin as a foreign language, I got this question all the time from students. Can I raise the end of my sentence to turn it into a question? And my answer was a very stern no. However, I was wrong. Or rather, I was being quite simplistic about the answer. The bigger question is, can both tone and intonation exist in Mandarin Chinese, something that sounds like a total contradiction? Turns out there's been a lot of really smart people, aka linguists, doing the research quietly behind the scenes for decades. And luckily for you, I decided to read all that and summarize it up for you. However, as with any linguistics research, the results are simply descriptive, meaning we are still discovering and analyzing the linguistic phenomenon behind what we hear and what we speak. Whether or not this will help you on your Chinese learning journey is up to you. But I know a lot of you have been asking for months about this, so I decided to make a video about it. So without further ado, it's not just tones, Chinese also has intonation. So we're going to tackle this topic in 4 different steps. The first step is going to be tone and intonation basics. So we're going to talk about what exactly tone and intonation are. And then we're going to talk about tone and intonation in Chinese, an overview. And number 3, we're going to go specifically into the research behind Chinese intonation and what it tells us about Chinese intonation. And lastly, the takeaway, aka what I think you should remember from this video. So we're going to start off with tone and intonation basics. So this is just an overview for those of you who are not well versed in linguistics, but are interested in language. So tones, what are they? And you probably can think of, if it goes up, if it goes down, that helps change the meaning. And that's entirely true. But let's talk about linguistics overview of what tones are. So tones, also called lexical tones, are applied to either a syllable or a full word or morpheme. So in Chinese, it applies to a specific syllable, which sometimes is a full word and sometimes it's just a morpheme. And tones, not just like, a intonation, it functions as similarly as consonants and vowels in many other languages without tones. The character for water in Chinese, shui, consists of 3 things to make it this word. It's the sh initial and the ui final, and then the tone 3. These are the 3 integral parts of making this word shui. And so what tones are is that they consist of a beginning and a final tone And it's either can be flat, it can be rising, it can be falling, it can be rise, fall, things like that. So the tones in these words or syllables are relative contours. They're not absolute contours. And we're going to talk more about that later. So examples of tonal languages include all Chinese languages, Thai, Vietnamese, as well as some African languages and some Native American and South Asian languages as well, such as Punjabi, Igbo, Navajo, things like that. And research has shown that tonal languages make up 60% of all the world's languages. And this might be surprising to you, but it shouldn't, because there are a lot of African and Native American languages out there that most of us are not familiar with. And now let's get into intonation. So what is intonation specifically? Intonation is pitch curves applied to entire sentences or phrases. And what they do is they are used to convey meaning and emotion. So outside of what the sentence is saying itself, it's adding an additional layer of meaning or emotion. And so example that we see common in English and many other languages is that if you want to ask a question, you simply raise the pitch of the last part of the sentence, like, you like broccoli? So intonation can come in several forms. It can be falling, rising, rise, fall. And they're usually used to denote things like commands, statements, questions, explanations, surprise, uncertainty, things like that. And the languages commonly cited to have intonation are English, Spanish, French. However, most languages, if not all, make use of intonation. And so tones and intonation are commonly kind of pitted against each other. So when you learn a new language, they'll say, okay, this language has intonation, like English or French. Or some languages are tonal, like you have to use the pitch of each word or syllable to differentiate the meaning. And so you commonly see that, tone languages are Chinese, Vietnamese, Thai, and then intonation languages like English, French, Spanish, other Indo-European languages. These are so-called intonation languages. But the truth of the matter is that the existence of tones in a language does not preclude it from having intonation. The only issue is, how can they coexist? So before we talk about that, we have to talk a little bit about fundamental frequency, or F0. So this is a bit more technical, but I think you guys can definitely understand. So fundamental frequency, or F0, is commonly used when analyzing spoken speech, especially with tonal languages. And F0, fundamental frequency, is the rate of vocal fold vibrations. So this is measured in hertz, or Hz. And so a higher F0 is a higher pitch, and a lower F0 is a lower pitch. And you can imagine, since women tend to have a higher vocal register than males, female F0s tend to fall within a higher range than males do. And so when you hear recordings of people who speak Chinese or other tonal languages, the females' F0 for their tones tend to be higher than the males' F0 for their tones. So with all of that, we can finally talk about tone and intonation in Chinese. So Chinese tones are often taught in a very specific sense. So, we have this tone chart of like the lowest being 1 and highest being 5. And so tone 1 is a high flat tone, a 5-5. Tone 2 is a rising kind of 3-5. Tone 3 is a dipping 2-1-4. And then fourth tone is a falling 5-1. And this is true technically, but only if every word in Chinese existed in a vacuum. And so, for example, the commonly cited ma, 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 right? So ma, high 5, right? Ma, 3-5, ma, 2-1-4, and ma, 5-1, right? So this is fine. It's not incorrect. But if you put these words together in a phrase or a sentence, now their tone pitch values change completely. So let's just say I try to say a really weird sentence with these words. Mother scolds the mother horse. Okay, we got ma, 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 ma. Okay, so what is the actual pronunciation of the tones? We actually have ma, okay, flat, high, good. Ma, dropping, fine. Ma, okay, low, and then, but it doesn't go up. And then ma is actually quite low. So basically, the last ma, which is technically a high tone 5-5, is now actually closer to a flat 3-3. So why does this happen, right? This happens because tonal languages have something called downdrift. So tonal downdrift is when high and low tones interacting with each other in a phrase make the high tones end up lower as you go toward the end of that phrase. It happens in pretty much all tonal languages, with some exceptions, and native speakers of these tonal languages are not aware that they do it. It's just like a natural phonological occurrence that just happens, whether you're aware of it or not. And so this phenomenon actually sets apart like native speakers and robots. So if you listen to kind of like AI speech of Chinese, even though all of the tones are correct, everything is fine, they don't sound very natural. And why is that? Because AI, at least as of now, does not have tonal downdrift kind of built into it. They might have that in 5 or 10 years. We don't know. They might be really, really good. But as of now, this is something that I don't think that AI models have latched onto. And also foreign learners of Chinese sound like kind of robotic because they don't naturally incorporate downdrift into their speech. They're kind of just memorize the tone contours and then just applying it to their whole speech. So making them sound more robotic. So this is an example of downdrift from a pretty weird sentence in a research project that we're going to talk about later. And so the sentence here is Yang Mingyi 要买蓝油笔. Yang Mingyi wants to buy a blue oil brush. And so as you can see, the tone curves of these sentences, they continue to drop steadily throughout the sentence, right? And so the pitch curves of each of them are not, equal length, necessarily equal height, equal, contour. So as you can see that the two tone twos at the beginning of the word for this person's name, Yang Ming, it kind of like starts 2 and then it goes even higher. We're doing like 3-5 and then like 5-7, right? So as you can see, when we talk in Chinese, it is a natural progression. We're not sticking solidly to like a 1-5 and then resetting for the next tone. Same thing with the second two, tone 4, we have tone 4 and then kind of a break for the word Yang Mingyi and then Yao, right? So we are kind of like makeshifting our 1-5 scale as we go. Obviously the 1-5 scale doesn't really exist. It only is, there for you to kind of show non-native speakers what the tones are like. Something I wanted to mention here is if you remember from math class, you can make something called the best fit line from all of the points in a graph. And you can do the same thing here. So we can find the best fit line for all of the kind of pitch, the specific pitches of our tone curves. And what that is this line, this blue line that you can see going down, showing our downdrift. And we're going to call this our phrase curve, basically the baseline of our tones as we go further and further into the phrase. And so you can see that it is not flat, right? It is not just like, right? Because of this, since it's not flat, it shows downdrift. We know that the tone values in Chinese in a phrase can change relative to the phrase curve. So in theory, since we know that tone values can change relative to the phrase curve, it's possible that intonation curves also exist in Chinese, meaning that the tones just have to change relative to where that intonation curve is. So it's a big discovery, but how do tones and different types of intonation curves interact in Chinese? To answer that, we're going to have to turn to the research. There are varying beliefs on Chinese intonation within the Chinese linguistics research space. And so some people believe that questions just have overall higher pitch curves than statements. And some people think that there is no significant interaction between pitches and intonation types. And so we're going to have to look at actual research done to kind of verify these, right? One of the first really big research projects that gave some really interesting ideas was Shen, 1990. Shen posited 3 basic intonation curves for Beijing Mandarin, and these were the 3 curves that Shen proposed. So the first type is assertive intonation. So this is something like 我喜欢吃苹果. It's just very much like your normal statement, right? So you can see it going up and then going down. It's pretty much flat, but as we can see, eventually it does go down in a regular statement. And the second type of curve is 2 unmarked questions and particle questions. So this, makes up most questions. So unmarked questions are kind of like basically a regular sentence, but with a question mark at the end. So 我喜欢吃苹果. So that would be one of the type 2, and the other type 2 would be 你喜欢吃苹果吗? So ma is a particle, and so that is what they're talking about. These questions, Shen says that it starts higher than a regular sentence, but then when it falls at the end, it's actually falling in the same kind of tone pitch space as a regular sentence. And then the last intonation curve that Shen posits is type 3. This is what Shen calls a not a question. So it's very unique to Chinese. A not a, like 你喜不喜欢吃苹果? This is what she means by type 3. And so type 3 is kind of starting at the same location as type 2, much higher than a statement, but then it ends kind of like going up. So that is what Shen predicts. And so based on these results, Shen's major conclusion is that the way we can tell a statement from a question in Chinese is to look at the first part of the utterance. A question has a significantly higher starting pitch than the statement. Right? And as for the intonation curves of the 2 types of questions, you can see that type 2 actually falls at the end. It falls as much as a regular statement. So this seems to be quite contradictory to what we know about question intonations in other languages. So I think it's really interesting to note. After that, there was another research project done by some researchers at Cornell University and Bell Labs, and they mapped out sentence and question pairs using STEM-ML, which is a tagging system for prosody. And they basically had pairs of sentence and questions, the exact same sentence and question, except the question just has a question mark. So as you can see, there is, a major difference between these 2. The starting pitch is higher already. You can see on the right side, the question, it is kind of going higher, right? The curve is higher on the question. And then if we look at the second part of the sentence, the kind of fluctuations of the last 2 characters, 有比, tend to be much more kind of like magnified, right? You can see that the tone 2, instead of just going up like this, it went really up. And then tone 3, which is normally not very very high at the end, it is going very high at the end for the question. And so what we had here was a low tone that ended the sentence, like 蓝有比, right? So how would the ending pitch curves be different if we had questions ending in tone 2, which is, tone 2 normally going up? This is classically a question intonation. And then what would happen if we had questions ending in tone 4, which is classically a statement? So we can look at a side-by-side comparison of a sentence and question that ends in tone 2. So the sentence here is 礼拜五罗燕要买羊. So yang is tone 2, it goes up at the end, and this is a sentence, right? On the left, this is just a declarative sentence, not a question. And on the right, it is 礼拜五罗燕要买羊. So that is the question, right? We are not changing any part of the sentence. We are just adding a question mark and having a native speaker say these, right? And so this is how the native speaker in this research project said these. So as you can see, the very ending part is that we're emphasizing the tone 2, right? So as we know, for English or French or a lot of these languages, we're going up for question intonation, right? And so here we can see that the yang is heavily emphasized. It's magnified as if we're trying even more to make this yang, like 罗燕要买羊, right? We're asking a question here, right? So that is kind of going into the direction of, okay, maybe there is some kind of uplift for the end of a Chinese question, but we still have to look at tone 4, right? So tone 4, as we know, it goes like this, and that is usually a statement intonation. But in Chinese, we can end a question with a tone 4, right? And so the sentence pair we have here is 礼拜五罗燕要买鹿. So 鹿 is a tone 4. And then on the right, we have the question of this, 礼拜五罗燕要买鹿, right? So what do we see here? We see pretty much the same thing as we saw just now. We saw that, in tone 2, the question went even more tone 2. So we see here that we're ending a tone 4. The question is ending even more a tone 4. It is an even bigger drop at the end. So this kind of shatters our perception that Chinese question intonation goes up at the end, right? So we can clearly see that the intonation of Chinese doesn't follow the intonation of other languages, especially when asking questions. So Chinese always maintains the correct pitch contours relative to each other, no matter what kind of intonation it is, whether it's a sentence or whatever. And so the takeaway from all of this, so I just want to preface by saying this video was a bit heavy on the technical aspects, but I hope the majority of you were able to stay with me for the majority of the video. I tried to make it as easy to understand as possible, but if there's anything you're confused about, please ask me in the comments and I'll answer you. And so overall, intonation in Chinese doesn't really follow the patterns that you may be familiar with in English or your native language. But it's important to know that intonation does exist in Chinese and that it's multifaceted. And so what we really want to take away from this is that Chinese has tonal downdrift, right? We know that as we're saying a sentence, the tones just kind of get lower and lower until the end of the phrase, where it's kind of like just getting, there's not much room for a lot of tone variation at the end. And at the same time, it also have updrift. Updrift as in, if you have two high tones, we're not going to go reset, right? You're not going to say yang, ming. We're going to say yang, ming. So there's kind of an organic connection between the tones in a phrase or a sentence in Chinese. And second of all, questions have higher pitch. As you can see, there is a lot of research showing that just generally the statement questions are much lower than the question overall. And then at the end of the sentence for questions, there is a magnified tone contour. If it's supposed to go up, it goes even more up. If it's supposed to go down, it goes even more down. So that is what we see for questions in Chinese. And so before I looked into this research, I have to be really honest with you, I had never really thought about Chinese intonation curves. As Chinese is my native language, I don't think about the intonation or what tones are as I'm speaking or as I'm planning to say something. However, the research that I've done and I've presented here, they correlate to my own experiences. So questions are more lexically pressing than statements. When we ask questions, we want answers. And it's very important that the listener knows that they should respond to my question. So I think it makes a lot of sense that the pitch curves for questions are higher than statements. Higher pitch is normally associated with stress, when we want to emphasize something. And then magnifying the final two syllables or so of a question makes a lot of sense to me because they're magnifying these tones to make it clear what exactly we're saying. So the listener has no doubt in their mind if this is a tone 3 or tone 4. I'll make it very clear for you. I want to buy lu, not yang, right? So that is very important. I'm going to emphasize that. And so the tone 4 is going to become more of a tone 4. Tone 2 is going to become more of a tone 2. And so the one last thing I just want to say is, please, if you don't take anything else from this video, just note you cannot change the last tone of the sentence to make it into a question. That is the most important thing. So if you're watching until now, I really want to thank you so very much. Even for me, this was a difficult video to research and script out, and it means the world to me that you're still watching. And so if this video has been at all helpful to you, I hope you can like, comment, and subscribe, and see you next time.